Have you ever found yourself lingering and chatting with coworkers and thought to yourself, I have to quit wasting time? Well, my guest today says that lingering is actually a good thing. Welcome to Work Better, a Steelcase podcast where we think about work and ways to make it better. I'm your host, Chris Congdon, and I'm here with our producer, Katie Pace.
Hi, Chris. I think I gotta admit, I'm the queen of lingering. I love a good social catch-up after the meeting.
Yeah, I think we've both done our fair share of lingering. And today's conversation is one that we might want to linger over because it's a replay from our very first season. And we spoke to author and professor Eric Klinenberg. And this is one of my all-time favorite episodes.
Me too.
Because Eric's work, his research about what makes community thrive, has really had an impact in how we think about workplace design at Steelcase. And what he's learned about what helps communities to thrive is really something that translates well into the workplace.
Eric is a professor of social science and director of the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU. He's the author of many books, including Palaces for the People, a fantastic book that argues the places where people gather and linger strengthen personal ties and interactions across groups.
So just to let you know, Eric joined us from his car, but don't worry, he pulled over first, and he talked to us about loneliness, libraries, and lingering.
If you're as inspired by this conversation as we were, remember to like it and share it with a friend or a colleague. Here's the conversation.
Thank you for joining us, Eric.
It's good to be here. Well, wherever here is. I don't even know where here is anymore.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit more because your work has been really a strong influence in a lot of our thinking about the future of the workplace and the future of offices, particularly your work around social infrastructure. So we're going to want to talk about that as we move forward. But, I've talked to a lot of people about your ideas and I've shared a lot of stories. And one of the stories that I've shared with people is about two neighborhoods that you studied in Chicago that went through a really catastrophic weather event. And I was wondering if you could just tell us that story in your own words.
Thank you for asking that question. The first book I wrote was a book about a heat wave in Chicago that happened in 1995 and killed more than 700 people. And when I started work on that project, I drew a map of who died and where they lived, which neighborhoods were most affected. Mm-hmm. And I noticed something popped up right away that no one had really seen before. And that is that the map looked more or less like what you would expect it to look like in terms of which neighborhoods were most affected. It wasn't super interesting, even though it was politically important to say that the neighborhoods that were most affected were poor and segregated and suffered from a lot of problems. But what I saw that people hadn't seen is that there were a set of neighborhoods that were paired, like these matching pairs where you had two neighborhoods next to each other, same demography, same age structure, same level of poverty, same identity for the most part. And yet, despite all their similarities, they had dramatically different death rates. I called attention to a couple pairs of neighborhoods. One pair is a neighborhood called Englewood on the south side and the neighborhood next to it called Auburn Gresham that's right next door. Mm-hmm. And again, if you looked at them on paper, you would think that they were identical kinds of places, that they'd have very similar experiences. But in reality, what happened is that Englewood wound up with a death rate that was 10 times higher than Auburn Gresham. And I wanted to understand why.
Wow.
Wow is exactly the right answer. It didn't seem to make a lot of sense. Yeah. The right response. But what happened when I started spending time in the neighborhoods is that I noticed that despite the similar numbers, the neighborhoods were different in some really important ways. Englewood as a neighborhood felt really bombed out. It had a lot of abandoned homes. It had a lot of empty lots. It had very little kind of street life, a few parks, playgrounds, neighborhood libraries, community institutions. In the 1990s, it was a really depleted place. Mm-hmm. And Auburn Gresham, even though it was right across the street, didn't have those abandoned properties. It didn't have empty lots. It had a whole set of small commercial outlets, the little parks and a big church that provided a lot of services. And I came to think of the difference between those two neighborhoods as differences in the social infrastructure. Um, Englewood had a depleted social infrastructure. Auburn Gresham had a really robust and dynamic one. And when I say social infrastructure, what I'm referring to specifically is the set of physical places that shape our interactions, physical gathering places like a good sidewalk or a neighborhood library or a playground. The neighborhoods in Chicago that were very poor and very vulnerable, but also had strong social infrastructure, did much better than the neighborhoods in Chicago that were poor but didn't have social infrastructure. And I came to realize that this thing, social infrastructure, it's not a luxury good. It's essential for a good city, a good neighborhood. It's, in a crisis, the thing that makes the difference between life and death.
Most of us think about infrastructure in a traditional sense. We think about transportation systems and bridges and roads and those kinds of things. But I'd love you to talk a little bit more about social infrastructure. Like, what was it that defined those kinds of places? What did they do that's very different than when we think about traditional infrastructure?
Well, social infrastructure is not a metaphor. It's just as real as the infrastructure for water or for power or for communications. And the idea, which I write about in this book, Palaces for the People, is that if you invest in social infrastructure, if you design it well, if you build it well, if you maintain it, if you program it, you create an environment, a physical environment that encourages social life. That in a neighborhood like Englewood or Auburn Gresham in Chicago, good social infrastructure will draw people out of their homes and into gathering places where they will encounter one another and potentially provide, learn about each other and learn to provide each other with support. Know who's going to be in trouble when there's a heat wave and who they don't have to worry about. If you don't have good social infrastructure, it makes you much more likely to kind of hunker down at home.
Mm-hmm.
You spend time in front of your screen because why would you go out into a public realm that doesn't encourage other people to be there?
Yeah.
And so social infrastructure refers to this set of physical places that truly determines the quality of our public realm.
So why do I need a physical structure to do that, given all the technology that I have available to me? So, you mentioned that if I don't have social infrastructure, I might be inclined to hunker down on my screen. So why do I need the physical places? Like, why do I need my neighborhood, street life?
Yeah, I mean, I'm betting that everybody who's listening to this could answer that question by referring back to their own experience in the pandemic these last couple of years. I mean, thank goodness we had FaceTime and Zoom and Skype and all these amazing technologies that allowed us to connect with each other when we were quarantined at home and locked down, and gathering physically wasn't safe or possible for so many people. But if I told you right now that I just found out while we were on this podcast that we found a new variant of the coronavirus,
Mm-hmm.
new variant of COVID-19, and this one is going to be significantly more lethal than the ones before and also more transmissible. And the only way for us to deal with it would be...
say that.
Well, but it answers your question, right? Because if I said, now we're really going to have to go lock down at home again, and we're going to do it for a year this time, and we're not going to be able to gather together, we're not going to be able to do it indoors, and we're not even going to be able to do it much outdoors. But don't worry, because you're going to have your technology, you're going to have your screen. You can connect with each other as much as you want on your screen. I think you'd want to tear your hair out. Probably worse. And the reason is because from your experience in the early part of the pandemic, just how insufficient that way of living is. Yep. And from having lived through the pandemic in the hardest stages, how much we need to be together and how much more satisfying it is to be with other people physically, how much easier it is to build a relationship, to provide support, to feel some sense of joy, in our companionship with one another. And I think we all are aware at this point, if we weren't before, that yes, it's nice to have technology and screens as a supplement to our face-to-face interactions, but it certainly is not a substitute.
Yeah. There's a great debate, of course, that's been going on throughout the pandemic, and we're still trying to figure it out, I think, in terms of work and in terms of working in an office. Because there's a lot of people who would say, do I really need to physically be with my colleagues? I'm doing just fine. My productivity is fine. So when we started having this conversation, I thought a lot about your work and thinking about social infrastructure and like what that might do for us in terms of having people feel like this is a place where I want to come and I want to be with my colleagues. And I'm just curious, what do you think about the idea of social infrastructure in the workplace or in an office? Like, what would that be?
I think it's essential, and I think some offices have it, and some offices don't have it. And for instance, I run an institute at New York University where I teach. It's called the Institute for Public Knowledge, and when it's going well, it works as a kind of oasis for people on campus, for faculty, for students, for people in the community who want to come and engage ideas. When we are full and active and busy, we have a blend of gathering places where people can socialize with each other, the kind of water cooler writ large. Those are, small seminar rooms and meeting rooms. Those are some open spaces with big tables where people can sit and have meals together or just catch up on things. We have small working tables. We have private offices where people can go and write and not have to be with other people because you don't necessarily want to work in an open space all the time. And we have a very kind of open door policy where the Institute is accessible to all kinds of people, in the university and outside the university, professors as well as students. And we encourage people to come and spend time there. And when it's working, it makes the work day more interesting. It means, people can engage each other. They can have spontaneous conversations about things that they're interested in. They can follow up on the idea of something presented in a seminar. Sometimes we'll have events and then we have time afterwards where people can have a drink or eat. The food and drink is a nice way to convene people together. But if you have to eat it by yourself in a single cell, it's very different than if you're eating it or drinking it with other people in a shared place. And so, offices around the world, we're getting adapted before the pandemic hit to work better as social spaces. Why? Because some people believe that collaboration works better when people can be together formally and informally. Some people believe that people enjoy work more and are happier at work and do better work when they can be around other people whose company they like. Some people believe that it's only when you have a shared environment and people can be together that you can develop something like a workplace culture, and that helps people learn about the organization that they're in, learn the values of the organization, learn the practices of the organization, learn the principles of the organization. And often it makes the job more exciting and compelling. And so I think one of the really interesting things that happened in the pandemic is, we learned that in the United States, especially, people were spending way too much time in the office. And we're feeling like office culture wasn't flexible and open enough. And there are ways that we can be productive when we're at home or working remotely sometimes. But if you push that too far, then you can't have a shared office culture. You can't have a shared work life. You don't make the connections, the forms of collaboration, creativity that you get when you have a healthy office environment built around good social infrastructure. And so it's completely relevant for the office.
I love this because we've been talking a lot about this idea about, what if the workplace drew inspiration from, we thought a lot about the neighborhood story that you told and about, thriving neighborhoods that have that great vibe and the great street life and the energy and how that could translate to work. And one of the things that you've talked about a lot is the role of different public places like the library in particular. And I just wonder, what is it that a library does that you could say, if you were going to have the version of a public library at work, what would that experience be like?
Well, I mean, one of the things about the library that's so special about the public library is that it's built to be open and accessible and welcoming to a wide range of people. And
Hmm.
one of the nice things about the library is that you encounter people who are not exactly like you. And of course, offices work according to different principles. Now, there is some really good research showing that in many, not all industries, the workplace is significantly more diverse than the neighborhood where people live. And people do have a chance in some office cultures to interact with, befriend, collaborate with people who have different ethnic, cultural, religious, racial backgrounds. And often they have interactions with people who have different political ideologies. And
Yep.
so there is a way in which the office can be a meeting ground for people who might not otherwise interact. And, I don't know if everybody shares this view, but it feels to me like we are living in a time of unsustainable polarization and divisiveness. And we need to find some way of relearning how to be together without killing each other. So you can create an office environment that has some of the inclusivity of the library. You can create places where people can explore. You have to build a corporate culture that allows people that time for exploration and creativity. And some offices do that, others don't. And libraries are interesting in that they're different kinds of spaces that are programmed differently. The rooms encourage people to do certain kinds of activities, whether it's reading a newspaper or periodical, or looking for a book, or watching a video, or using a makerspace, or sitting and having coffee. Offices similarly can have rooms that are programmed to encourage different kinds of activities. And so I think an office can't replicate the most beautiful thing about a public library, but it can definitely borrow some of the better ideas.
I love my local library because I feel like it draws in this really diverse group of people. It's like this magnet that pulls all kinds of people together. And, having that experience at work is really something that I think a lot of people, have been missing, that kind of connection with other people. So, Eric, I want to go back a ways, back before you wrote Palaces for the People, because you also wrote a book, Going Solo. I thought was really interesting because, you were looking at this major social trend of, people choosing to live alone. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that, because I want to connect that to this conversation that we've just been having about social infrastructure. So can you tell people a little bit about your research there?
Yeah, I mean, that book actually was born from my book about the heat wave, which was a story about people being very isolated, socially isolated, hundreds of people dying alone at home in a kind of a sad and tragic way that reflected something about the isolation of our time. And I started doing work on a book that I had tentatively titled, as you said, Alone in America, because I thought it was going to be about the rising isolation of Americans. And what I learned when I started doing research on this is that it was definitely true that Americans were becoming much more likely to live alone, more people living alone in the United States than ever before in our history, more people living alone around the world than ever before. But the surprise from the research I did, which involved hundreds of interviews and analysis of a lot of survey data about our social lives, is that on average, people who live alone are actually quite socially active. In fact, surprisingly, people who live alone in the United States are more likely to spend time with friends and neighbors than people who are married. They're more likely to volunteer in civic organizations. They're more likely to go to restaurants and clubs and bars and music venues and the gym. So living alone is not the same as being socially isolated. And in fact, one of the things I discovered at the end of this project is that it's really our interdependence that makes our independence possible. And what has made living alone more viable, in addition to the fact that, women gained tremendous power to control their own lives and their own bodies, but so too did the rise of the public realm, where people were able to live by themselves, but be very social with others.
And you had said something that struck me as quite interesting, is that people who live alone, particularly in urban areas, tend to treat like the city as like their living room, if I got that straight.
Yeah, I mean, the apartment is, for a lot of people who live alone who are socially active, the apartment is kind of like a launching pad, and the urban neighborhood is like a living room. You you get a place of your own, not because you want to spend all of your time sitting home alone, but because you want to be close to things that are important to you. And so the neighborhood matters, and the people around you matter, and the amenities matter. And in fact, what I saw in the real estate market when I was working on this book is a lot of real estate developers that were building, new developments in central urban areas, trying to go after this market of young professionals, specifically by building, projects that had slightly smaller domestic private space, but much more generous shared amenities, like coffee bars and computer rooms and exercise areas and film screening areas and all these things that we maybe associate with like a college campus. But it turns out people like that kind of social programming and want it even as they get older. And you know what else? In that book, I read a little bit about my grandmother, who was living in an assisted living facility at the time, and she was in her 90s. But the assisted living facility was set up so that she could also have all of these social interactions in shared spaces. And the units were a little smaller than they might be in other places. But the point of being there was to have companionship.
And all of this is an example of social infrastructure, right?
Very much. It's about building a way of living, building places that encourage lingering, gathering.
Yep.
I wrote in Palaces for the People that we like efficiency in all kinds of ways in American life, but when it comes to social life, efficiency is really our enemy. When you build systems that just allow people to move through them without friction, right? Just getting your thing done and moving on to the next place so you can get home faster. I mean, I want that when I'm driving somewhere or when I'm on public transit. I don't want to sit and linger on the subway. But for more social occasions, the lingering really is important, and too much efficiency can be a bad thing.
Yeah, I love the idea of thinking about places where we linger and where we want to linger.
Well, think about people who take a trip to Europe or to Latin America or Asia, and they come back and say, oh, it's so amazing, there's this whole street life, and you sit in a cafe and you sit outside for hours, and people they hang out in the square or the Zocalo. There's not really the sense that you have to, buy your Big Mac and get out in 30 minutes.
Right.
There's no loitering signs. The whole point of going to a bar or restaurant in Italy is to loiter. The whole point of going to the Zocalo in Mexico is to loiter. You want to sit around because that encourages a kind of sociability that has value. And it's not something I think that we have supported enough in American culture, and not something that we value as much as we should, because it really affects our quality of life.
Well, I might get in trouble with a number of business leaders if I start encouraging loitering at work. But on the other hand, I have found that it is profoundly productive in a way that maybe people don't think about productivity, but it's profoundly productive when you do have those moments of serendipitous interaction where you get a chance to actually talk to somebody that you might not schedule a meeting with, or they might not be in your regular network, but people that you see and end up talking to over a coffee. So you do end up lingering a little bit in some of those kinds of places and having conversations that you might not have otherwise had. So it feels like that's a really important thing.
Yeah, I was saying, in the Palaces book, I write about being a soccer dad and spending my weekends, hour after hour after hour on these fields full of people who I would never otherwise encounter in my life. And, sometimes I want to get on my phone and talk to the people who are in my family or my close friendship group who I don't get to see enough. But inevitably, I wind up engaging all kinds of people who I would never speak to in a different universe. We're there because we love our children, we like this game, and we're on a field where we're going to be hanging out for many hours watching a game. And we strike up, relationships, and we do it more when we go for lunch after the match or when we take a trip somewhere for the weekend. And, I think there's a reason why so many Americans who go to residential colleges build these relationships there that last a long time and have trouble building those relationships when they get into later stages in their lives, because they have more unstructured time and because they have set of gathering places where they can spend that social unstructured time engaging other people and having surprising things happen. It's hard to do that when your whole life is scheduled and organized and everything is, efficient and a routine.
Yeah, I think the half-hour video meeting is really taking its toll on a lot of people. Before I let you go today, Eric, and this has been a great conversation, I'm so grateful for you taking the time. Do you have any last parting thoughts if you're talking to a bunch of people who are thinking about work or thinking about the workplace and the office? Any last thing you want to say to any of us?
Well, I think, ideally the office is a compelling and exciting place where we can go, not just to get work done, but also to, generate new ideas and to recharge and build relationships. And when you work in a good office, you feel all those things and you enjoy going there. And when you don't work in a good office, you'd much rather just be at home on your own private screen. And so, especially now when the option of working remotely has emerged and has become a demand for many people, at least some of the time, I think it's important for every organization to think about how to make the place work well. How do you draw people into the workspace? How do you recruit people who aren't already there by making it feel like a compelling job? How do you keep people who are in a job growing and developing, feeling good about what they're doing? How do you make sure that the work is as good as it possibly can be and not just the reflection of what's in one individual's solitary mind? And the answer to all those questions is, you have to build an office environment that's welcoming and open and accessible and that makes people feel turned on and engaged. And it's striking to me that some organizations really get that and do it. And we've all seen the images of the big tech company office complexes in Silicon Valley where there's soccer fields and swimming pools and massage rooms and cafeterias with free food and snack bars and, all these wonderful things. Unfortunately, not for every employee, just for the higher level people. That's also a podcast for another day. And we've also seen the kind of old-fashioned offices that are just rows of people working in solitary cubes.
Yeah.
And I don't think you can really have a good office today without thinking about social infrastructure. If you do, you're missing an opportunity to make the experience of working there much better for everyone.
Yeah. Well, I would just like to say to our listeners that I think Eric's work on social infrastructure is given us so much to think about. First of all, if you haven't seen your neighbors or haven't gone to your local library, I would make sure to get out there and make some of those connections right at home. And if you haven't gone into the office in a while, or you haven't even thought about the office as a source of social infrastructure or social connections, I think Eric has given us a lot to think about how can we use place to help people not only feel those connections, but to feel part of a community at work. So thank you so much for spending some time with us today, Eric. It really has been a pleasure to talk with you.
For me as well, thank you. And I'm expecting to get some really nice Steelcase bookshelves very soon. It's going to show up in the mail. I just want them to show up. What is that giant bookshelf doing, honey? I didn't order that. Oh, you don't know about my podcast life.
Oh, well, we can figure something out there, Eric, anyway.
Okay. Talk to you soon.
Okay. Thank you so much for taking the time. And I promise to stop bugging you now. But you did mention podcasts in the future. So, we might come back to you one of these days.
You never know.
All right. Thanks, Eric.
Take care. Thank you again.
Bye-bye.
Is your workplace ready for the new ways people are working today? Steelcase has all of its latest solutions to help you refresh your office in one place. Steelcase.com/WBnew. Explore new ways to collaborate anywhere, anytime, and see better ways to focus and block out distractions. That's at steelcase.com/WBnew.
Thanks for being with us today. I can't believe this is the end of our 5th season already.
We covered so much this season. If you missed any of our episodes, go back and listen. They really do stand the test of time. We talked about creating psychological safety at work, teaching AI-ready students, how we can increase our attention spans at work, why having a beautiful workplace matters.
And we also talked about how we can build more brain capital, why AI shouldn't be so scary, and Gallup helped us understand how to cope with all the change that we're facing these days. It really was a lot, but it was really helpful.
And we want more people to hear these episodes too. If you enjoyed this conversation, would you subscribe or share it with a friend? You can also visit us at steelcase.com/research to sign up for weekly updates on research, insights, or design ideas delivered right to your inbox.
Thanks again for being here, and we hope your day at work tomorrow is just a little bit better. Thanks to everyone who helps make Work Better podcast possible, including our producers Rebecca Charbowski, Stav Kontis, Chiara Licari, Branda Lasik, and Katie Pace. Creative direction is by Aaron Ellison. Editing and sound mixing is by Soundpost Studios. Technical support comes from Mark Caswell, Sean McManaman, and Jose Jimenez. Digital publishing is by Areli Ariano and Jordan Marks.